So, Glenn Ryder here, and I wanted to talk about the ban on mountain biking in Watchung Reservation and the last 3 years, or at least 2014 through 2017, efforts to get mountain bike access in the park, which unfortunately failed because the government basically went back on its word. It had been promising for 3 years that we would be getting mountain bike access, and just decided at the last minute, after hiring a consultant, paying them tens of thousands of dollars, re-amending the contract to pay them extra money for doing the work on the mountain bike trails. Then they canceled the idea of mountain bike trail access. Of course, the consultant's still getting paid, as far as we know. They never re-amended the contract to undo the changes. So, go figure. I guess contractor CME is going to get their money, but we're not going to get park access. And in fact, we didn't not only get bike access in Watchung, we lost access to all the other trails in the county. Because they not only decided to keep the ban in place for Watchung, as it's been since 1995, they decided to arbitrarily expand it to every other park in the county. And for 20 years, it's been just about Watchung. But the ban is what I want to talk about. See, we talked a lot about mountain biking, and so did the mountain biking opponents. We talked a lot about the benefits of mountain biking, and they talked about the perceived problems with mountain biking. And we talked about how mountain biking would be a good thing, and they talked about how it would be bad, and on and on. What nobody ever talked about was the government's ban on mountain biking, and I thought that was odd. See, the whole reason we were there was to undo the ban. We weren't there to stump for mountain biking. This was never about mountain biking. To some degree, you could say it was about mountain bike access, but it was never about mountain biking as such. It was only about mountain biking in as far as it was about mountain biking in the context of the government's having banned it 20 years ago. And what do we know about that ban? Well, thanks to Open Records Act requests, Open Public Records Act requests that myself and other people have filed, we know that the government never documented a single instance of a problem with mountain biking at Watchung. We know that they claim now that the ban was authorized by an ordinance from 1983 about roads, sidewalks, and paths, but also that according to the mountain biking white paper, which was written by Daniel Benier of the Union County Parks Department in 1995, so this is a contemporaneous thing, that it opens with the sentence, that white paper, mountain biking at Watchung Reservation has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. Now, that would be 5 years plus one minimum, because 5 years is just the period of dramatic increase. But that would put you back into 1989. And then you have, we know there was also no ban prior to 1993 at a minimum, because while the opening sentence of the white paper doesn't specifically come out and say it wasn't banned, it's very clear that that's what they are saying in a way, because they're saying mountain biking has dramatically increased at Watchung Reservation over the last 5 years. Why would it be dramatically increasing over the last 5 years if it was illegal and you had a policy in place to forbid it? He doesn't say sporadic illicit riding by the occasional person sneaking in has increased. Illegal mountain biking has increased. None of that. He just says mountain biking and Watchung has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. Now, that's just the period of dramatic increase. How long was it ongoing? We don't know. All we know is more than 5 years. 5 years will put you to 1990. More than 5 will put you to 1989. So we know from that, it's pretty clear that there was no ban, at least prior to 1989, or I should say from 1989 onwards. However, then we have later on in the white paper where the same guy explicitly states that the interim trail plan that was created in 1993 to officially recognize the mountain biking that had been ongoing and attempt to incorporate it into the parks program was created as an alternative to prohibiting the ongoing mountain biking. So wait a minute. He's saying essentially that they considered banning mountain biking in 1993, but decided not to. There's two problems with this. That doesn't jive with what he himself said in his later response to my Open Record Act request 20 years later. And it also, it essentially is an admission that there was no ban prior to 1993. If they were considering banning mountain biking in 1993, then at the very least, the only thing you can say then is that, well, we know that at least as of 1993, there was no ban on mountain biking. So we also know that the government came out and said, the Union County government here in New Jersey, that the ban was created in 1995, and this was I think mentioned in the white paper. I might be wrong; it might have been something else, but I think there was mention of it at least in the white paper. That the ban was created in 1995 in a backroom meeting by a handful of unelected officials. Now, I specifically asked the government for any public input or anything like that. They came back with, well, public input was not gathered prior to the decision. Whoa. So you're saying that a bunch of unelected people, not the freeholders, who are the ones who actually pass laws and ordinances that can be legally enforced on people, but a bunch of unelected people from who knows where got together in a back room behind closed doors and just like stuck their hands in the air and said, by the power of Grayskull, bikes are banned? Without telling the public, without any public input, and without even documenting a single instance of a problem at Watchung. That was another thing. I had asked for any, they said, well, mountain bikes were ruining the park and that's why they were banned. So I said, okay, where's your documentation of that? Well, pictures of trail ruts, trail studies, documentation of trail user conflict, injuries, tickets, anything. They came back with, well, we don't have anything. And then they said, but we have these 3 newspaper articles from the popular press about conflicts in other parks. And I was like, okay, but what does that have to do with Watchung? I mean, one of these articles was about some park in Connecticut. That's got nothing to do with Watchung. It doesn't say anything about the situation there. Then they had a trail study, but it was of 2 atypical trails in a park in another county, in Essex County. It also post-dated the decision to ban mountain biking in Watchung by almost a year. So clearly that couldn't have been source material for anything, couldn't have been relied upon in making that decision. It's not only not about Watchung, it didn't exist at the time that they made the decision to ban us. So unless there's a park machine parked in Daniel Benier's office, and it was worth noting, they said, we don't have any source material, but this guy who worked for the county, Daniel Benier, had a folder of bike stuff that has been moved several times over the last 2 decades, but he may still be able to find it. That's what we can provide you. But I filed an Open Record Act request. That's supposed to be for government official documents. It's not supposed to be for what somebody had in his private bike-hating stash. All right? Now, this guy worked for the county and still does, actually. But this wasn't something that he maintained in official capacity, and it wasn't about Watchung. It wasn't about Watchung. Now, there were 3 things in there which you might be able to say were about Watchung, except they weren't really documentation. There were 3 anonymous hand-scribbled complaints on like these little cards that were filled in at the trail center. And they said, like, hikers say there's too many bikers and they're annoying them, stuff like that. But what these essentially were is 3 statements to the effect that an anonymous person found another anonymous person or persons annoying, according to a third anonymous person, according to some objective standard of annoyance, which, or I should say subjective standard of annoyance, which being subjective essentially means nothing, can't be defined, can't be quantified, can't be, explained to anyone else. I mean, what's annoying, right? I mean, I find Britney Spears annoying. Somebody else might not like Bruce Springsteen, whatever. The point is that if you get something as simple as music, you go, okay, when a car drives by and you hear that on the radio, does that annoy you? Well, everybody's going to have a different response, right? So that an anonymous person found another anonymous person or persons annoying, according to a third anonymous person. We don't even know what these things say about their own 3 incidences, assuming those incidences actually occurred. What anybody did in those instances, the hiker, the biker, the bikers, whatever, if anybody did anything, or it was just somebody saw somebody else and was bothered by the fact that they were there, we don't know anything. All we know is that an anonymous person found another anonymous person bothersome, according to a third anonymous person. So these complaints, not only are they not documentation of the situation at Watchung in terms of a general overview of the situation of the park and mountain biking there at the time, they're not even documentation of themselves, really. But those 3 anonymous complaints were the only thing about Watchung. All the other stuff in this file, the so-called trail study was done of 2 trails in another park in another county, and it wasn't done until after the decision to ban mountain biking. The 3 newspaper articles from the popular press, what the hell does that have to do with anything? They're not about Watchung. They're about other parks. Again, one was in Stamford, Connecticut. What the heck does this have to do with Watchung? And then the mountain biking white paper, which was provided when Daniel Benier wrote his response to my initial OPA request. He said, well, mountain biking was banned by an old ordinance. It was weird what he said. He said, first, we don't have anything to provide you about passing an ordinance because the government the freeholders never passed an ordinance to ban mountain biking. But there was this old ordinance on the books that banned mountain biking on the trails in the park. We suspended enforcement of that arbitrarily in 1993 and then resumed enforcement in 1995. Because enforcement was simply resumed, nothing had to be changed with the law or ordinance, and so there was no paper trail and there's no accountability and no documentation of anything. Sorry. He further explained that when the ordinance was resumed, he said that was done because there were accidents, there was injury, there was user conflict, and there was trail damage. However, they admit that none of that was ever provided. Now, there's a couple problems here. One, they've used the idea that there was widespread damage and trail problems and injury and all sorts of stuff in their narrative, in their story. That's been the official line for years. There was a problem, and that's why we had to ban it. Now we find out that there was never documentation of a single instance of that problem. Isn't that weird? I mean, I guess you could say, well, they never documented it because they were going to make this decision on their own in a back room in secret. And nobody was ever going to know what they did or be able to question it. So why would they bother to document reasons for their decision and evidence of a problem with mountain biking? Maybe, and that might very well allow you to dismiss the criticism that, well, there's no evidence of it. Isn't that weird? Why would you not document things that made your case? Well, if you're not going to be making a case to the public, in fact, if you're going to be keeping your decision from the public, then obviously that's not an issue. However, that then still begs the question, why was a decision of this magnitude, excluding as a category 1/3 of the people who use the park, hikers and horsemen being the other 2/3, why was a decision of this magnitude made behind essentially closed doors in like a smoke-filled back room? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you'd expect to associate with, caricatures of Tammany Hall. Yet, here we are in the 20th century, and well, now the 21st century, and it's still going on. Not cool, not cool. Also, we have the fact that Dan Benier said, well, speaking, of course, officially as a county person, we allowed it from 93, and then we just resumed it in 95. Now, saying that there was a ban before 93 allowed him to get around the fact that they didn't pass an ordinance or do anything. They just kind of, by the power of grace, go. Bikes are banned. And that allowed them, doing it in a back room without any public input, allowed them to, one, not have to document anything or worry about the fact that there was nothing to document or make a case to the public for this or anything like that, have public input for and against. If you just do it in secret, there's no need for that. It's a lot easier for the government. But also, that allows you to ignore the fact that there was no law, there was no nothing. But that relies on the fact that there was a ban prior to 93 for you to resume. But we know from the mountain biking white paper, which was authored by who? Daniel Benier, the same guy 20 years ago. We know from the mountain biking white paper that Daniel Benier said that in 1993, they considered banning mountain biking, but they instead decided to incorporate it into the trail plan. So he's saying, one, it was never banned before 1993. It wasn't banned before 1993. In 1993, there was no ban. They considered banning it, but then they decided not to and incorporated it into the plan. And then it was only 2 years later when people, I guess, didn't like the idea that they were sharing the park or thought they had experience with a few bad apples, whatever the case may be. People complained, and they decided, okay, no more mountain biking. And the decision to do that was made in a back room by the unelected, with no legislative authority whatsoever. And then it was only years later, 20 years later actually, that they officially linked this ordinance from 1983 to the 1995 ban. So you have the problem that the ban was created in 1995 by the unelected. The unelected don't make laws or ordinances. And if there was an ordinance beforehand, then yes, you could say, as they said in 2014 in the Oprah response, as Dan Bernir said, well, we were just resuming enforcement. Now that still leaves you the question of how is the government authorized to arbitrarily pick and choose which rules they enforce when? I mean, you shouldn't be allowed to do that, just arbitrarily suspend or resume enforcement of ordinances. But the point is, even assuming that's what they did, that only works if there's a previous ban to resume. But we know from the mountain biking white paper written by the same guy that at a very minimum, there was no ban prior to 1993, and that there was very probably no ban prior to 1989 or earlier, because, or I should say at least 1989 and possibly earlier, prior, because we have those two statements in the mountain biking white paper written in 95. One, mountain biking in Watchung has dramatically increased over the last 5 years, putting its incidence and frequency to at least 1989, because the last 5 years is only the period of dramatic increase, and that brings you back to 1990. So we know that there were people mountain biking there regularly, at least as far back as 1989. That kind of suggests that there was no ban before then. It's basically an admission of that. But what's even more telling is where they say, well, we were considering banning mountain biking in 1993, and instead we decided not to. And then 2 years later, we did ban it. What's telling about that? Well, if they were considering banning it in 1993, then there already wasn't a ban in 1993. So we have, on one hand, the timeline that, well, it was banned in 83, then allowed 93 through 95, and then resumed the ban. Or the fact that it didn't exist at all until 95 and was just made up in a back room. Or we have the fact that, as they said in a May 18th, 2017 NJ.com article, the government in that instance claimed that it was allowed from 94 through 95, whereas before they'd been saying from 93 through 95. And they never said when it was banned, whether it was 83 or 93 or whatever. So you've got already three different timelines. How is this acceptable? How is this normal? There's an old saying, I think it's attributed to Mark Twain, but whomever, that if all you do is tell the truth, you never have to bother with keeping your story straight. Right? By doing these things the way they're doing them, the very fact that there are at least 3 or 4 divergent timelines for something as simple as the most mundane fact of them all about anything, which is, when did it begin? Remember the old saying, begin at the beginning? Yeah. You can't do that with the Watchung mountain bike ban because nobody knows when the beginning was. Now, in some ways, I guess that's part and parcel of having your government conduct its business in secret, but without any public input. But at the same time, what you've done is there's multiple different narratives now. That I think is telling. It's essentially proof that somebody is lying about something. There wouldn't be 3 or 4 different stories if all of these people were all telling the truth, right? And as far as the trail damage being a thing, I mean, people talked about, there was damage to the trails in the park. Where was your documentation of that? The Open Public Record Act isn't optional. If they have the information, barring certain rare exceptions for things like personal information and anything that's still deliberative, if they have the information, they're required by law to turn it over. So if I asked for, okay, you said there was trail damage, where's your documentation of trail damage? And they don't provide it, then legally it doesn't exist. Now, you could say, well, maybe there was still trail damage, they just never documented it. Yes, but then you have to ask why. And there is no good answer to that. Again, you could say, well, maybe they just didn't document it because There was no reason to because they were doing this in secret. But then that beggars the question, why were they making a decision like this in secret? There's no way to try and explain this away that looks good for the government, that makes the ban appear honest and above board and forthright and done according to the basic governmental processes that we all take for granted, most of which include not only citizen involvement in the government itself and oversight, but simply the fact that we're aware of what it is our government is doing. No way to make this look good for them. And I think that's because it wasn't good. Life isn't just about perception. Yes, maybe it looks bad and maybe it's not. But when something looks this bad, you got to ask yourself, maybe that's because it is bad. And the very fact that, again, there's 3 or 4 different timelines tells me that somebody has to be lying about something, because there can't be, unless you believe in one of those like theoretical physics things like they talk about in Star Trek, where there could be 4 alternate universes. But then you're still left with the fact that even though that's the realm of fracking fantasy, how come all 4 of those stories are in this universe, right? Seriously. Unless you're on the Starship Enterprise talking to Spock in some fictional far-out galaxy somewhere, okay, we're talking the real world. There can only be one version of how things happen, and that's the way that they happened. And we're not talking about accidents and how they were written down. One person had it written down this way and one person had it written down this way. No. Because all of these things are coming from the same people. All of these statements are coming from the same Union County government. The same government says on one hand that it was banned in 93 and then that it was banned in 83 and then allowed from 93 through 95. But then the same people say, only a few years later, it was actually allowed from 94 through 95. Then the same people say, going back to 1995, when the ban was actually created, that there was never a ban before 1993, and that there was never a ban before 1989, at a minimum. Isn't that interesting? So how could they allow it for, 2 years or 1 year, depending on which narrative you talk to, the 93, 95 or the 94, 95? If there wasn't anything before 95, then both of those are... So you have at a minimum 3 different stories. And when you factor in the various variables from different things, you could be looking at 5 or 6. They all can't be right. Obviously, all or some of them are wrong because of the inherent contradictions here. Those contradictions only exist because somebody hasn't gotten their story straight. And I think that's the important part to take away from this. The fact that we have 3 or 4 or 5 different timelines for the mountain bike ban is an indication that even though the government has had an intervening quarter century to get its story straight about what they did in 1995 and didn't do, they haven't been able to do so. They've had 25 years to get their story straight, and they can't. That says a lot, okay? But all this stuff was never talked about, and it was never talked about because very quickly the issue became, once the anti-mountain bike people got involved, the issue became about mountain biking. The issue wasn't, we should never have been banned in the first place, and the way that it was done was dishonest, and it was an end run around the electoral process. And, the fact that the government never bothered to document anything, but there was supposedly this widespread problem, but then how come there's not a single instance of, and then nowadays when people at these meetings last year would come up and say, well, what about all the people who were injured by the bikers? Well, what about all those people? Let's see a police report. Let's see records of a 911 call. Let's see an ambulance receipt, police report, a ticket that was issued. Hello, anything, please. Nothing. Why is there nothing? I mean, did they not have the ability to record 911 calls? Did ambulance people not keep records? Somebody claimed at one of these meetings that a biker or somebody else was hit by a biker. I don't remember whether it was the biker, the other person, or just the biker crashed into a tree. I don't know. But somebody claimed that someone was injured as a result of mountain biking to the point where they had to be airlifted by a helicopter to a hospital facility. Are you telling me that if that ever happened, that there wouldn't be a single piece of paperwork somewhere to document it? So how come when I asked for documentation of trail user conflict, problems with mountain biking, etc., they had to come back and say they had nothing. But then they're turning around and saying, oh, but then what about this guy? He had to go in a helicopter. You blew your chance to even bring that up because I asked for documentation of that sort of thing, and you said there was nothing. Nothing. So now you're saying, well, but this guy got so badly hurt. If he got so badly hurt, I would have seen a paperwork for him, Mac. My problem is not just with the dishonesty in the past, in the 1990s. My problem is with the dishonesty that persists to this day. The fact that the people can make these claims about all these horrible things that bikers did back in the 1990s, mountain bikers, and then turn around and just totally overlook the fact that it's already been proven that there was no evidence for any of this. Legally, they can say that it happened, but they have no comeback when it's pointed out that there was no evidence. The fact that they're still bringing it up makes me wonder how stupid they think everybody is. And I think they think we're plenty stupid. I think they think we're plenty stupid because think about what happened here. They were able to get away with telling everybody there was a clear law in the books against something for 20 years when there wasn't. So of course they think about what they've been able to get away with. Of course they don't believe there's going to be any accountability for anything. And then nowadays, the current last 3 years of effort that was supposed to be focused on undoing the government's bad policy decisions of 20 years ago was somehow spun around and turned into this people bitching about mountain bikers and talking about, mountain biking, and the mountain bikers had to go on defensive to try and explain why they should be allowed to ride there. You know what nobody's ever been able to explain, including the county spokesman, going back to when I first got involved in this? The government's ban on mountain biking. Nobody's ever been able to explain why it was done in a convincing manner. Nobody's ever been able to give a concise and truthful and non-contradictory history of the ban. Something as simple as when did it start? Nobody's ever been able to answer the question of if the problems with mountain biking were so widespread that there couldn't be any kind of official compromise and incorporation of it, that they had to be banned. How come nobody ever bothered to document a single instance of that? If your excuse for that is going to be, well, it was done behind closed doors, why was it done behind closed doors? Why was a decision of this magnitude made essentially in a secret cabal by the unelected? And what authorized them to do that? Why was there only one ticket? You know, the government will only admit to giving one ticket in the last 10 years, up until 2014 or 15. Why was the only ticket they would admit in an Open Records Act request to having given for mountain biking and Watchung in the last 10 years not legally filled out? They not only had one ticket, but in the space for the ordinance or law that was violated, the officer simply wrote bike. And why was that, by the way? Is that because even the police officer didn't know what ordinance supposedly justified banning mountain biking? Was it because he knew that there really wasn't any? That the ordinance, they say, and have been saying for 20 years, bans bikes on the trails in the park, and they specifically use the word trail, never even contains the word trail? That if you read it, what it is about is it regulates riding on roads, sidewalks, paths, and says you shouldn't obstruct vehicle traffic, meaning in that context, motor vehicles, cars. None of this sounds like it has anything to do with the bikes on the trails in the park, which have been marked on maps as trails and described as trails for years, not sidewalks or paths or roadways. And then you have the fact that the ban, the ordinance predates the ban by over 10 years, that we know by the government's own admission, according to the white paper written by Daniel Veneer, that there was no ban in, at least as of 1989, and there was also no ban as of 1993. But the same guy said in 2014 that, we just resumed the ban after a hiatus. Now, in October, I don't know, it was 2016, I think. I'm trying to remember, but the last few years, we had a meeting at the Trailside Center where one of the county people got up there and said that he wasn't allowed to arbitrarily allow or disallow mountain biking, that would have to be the freeholders amending an ordinance or passing an ordinance or something. If there was an ordinance on the books that actually banned mountain biking and was connected to the ban from 1995 directly, you know what, that would be totally true. But as far as we know, there isn't. Also, if that's the case, and nowadays, in the 21st century, they're not allowed to arbitrarily disallow or allow something, then how come they were doing it in the 1990s according to Daniel Bonier's official government narrative in his 2014 response to my very first Open Record Act request? He says, well, we don't have anything to provide you about the passage of an ordinance because we just resumed the enforcement of this old ordinance after arbitrarily suspending it for a few years. But now they're saying, well, they can't do that. So did they do that back then, and were they supposed to? And then if they did, how does that square with the fact that there was no ordinance to suspend according to what the same guy wrote 20 years previous at the time the ban was implemented? That there was no ban prior to 1993 and no ban prior, at least up until 1989. Unbelievable. And how about the fact that they provided the mountain biking white paper as a reference essentially to itself? I asked for source material, and the first thing they provided me was the mountain biking white paper. Because they had in the very first response to my first Open Records Act request, they not only said, well, we resumed this old ordinance, no ordinance was passed, they also said, and we resumed it because mountain bikers were causing all these problems, and there was injuries, and blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, I asked for any trail studies, documentations of problems, etc. with mountain biking at Watchung. Show me your source material if that's indeed the case, as you say in your response. Then where's that source material? Because I did ask for it. So they came back with the mountain biking white paper. So essentially, they had some guy named Daniel Bonnier write a paragraph. And then when I questioned about the statements in the paragraph and that there was no documentation for them, even though that's what I had specifically asked for in my Open Records Act request, they responded with another essay that the same guy wrote, which just happened to be a little longer, that also had no source material or anything. I mean, if you know what a white paper is, it's essentially an essay that's written to argue for a government position. So it's essentially like the PR for a government policy. It's advocacy for a policy change or a policy position that the government either has taken or is going to take, etc. Which begs another question. Where's the white paper from 1983? If that's when the ban really began with the passage of this ordinance, shouldn't the white paper have been written then? Because that's when you're establishing a ban on mountain biking. I mean, I could see them writing another white paper in 1995 to argue for reimposing the ban, except that's not what that white paper argues for. What it actually very clearly says, it's in several instances in there, is that there was no ban beforehand. I mean, the very fact that it says they considered banning mountain biking in 1993 and decided not to. Well, if they were considering banning it in 93, then there was no ban, at least as of that point. And again, about the going back 5 years, that puts you into 1989. So we know it wasn't banned at least up until that point. Weird, ain't it? Yeah, a lot of this shit weird. And what's really weird is that nobody wanted to talk about any of it. Everybody wanted to talk about those evil mountain bikers. You know, the ones that, as far as we know, were never documented doing anything wrong. Now, we know there's jerks in every group. You know, there's jerks behind the wheel of a car. There's jerks walking in the woods. There's probably jerks riding bikes in the woods, too. I've biked a lot, so I've seen jerks of all types. The point is, nobody argues for banning cars just because you got a couple drivers who are assholes, or even a widespread problem with careless behavior behind the wheel. Nobody argues for banning hikers because hikers, let's say, litter or lie down in the middle of the trail and make out, causing a hazard. That, no joke, that actually happened. I was riding in this one park once, and there was this lady and her, I guess, boyfriend, and they were lying down in the trail making out when I came around the corner, and like, it was a near thing. I almost hit him. I mean, first of all, you don't look at ground level for humans, and secondly, like, you don't expect somebody to be lying in a trail making out. I don't, now, because I was being safe and I wasn't going too fast, I was able to stop. But I mean, holy shit, you do not expect to see that. So yeah, those two people, they were jerks. They were creating a hazard on the trail by being jerks and oblivious and all of that. Now, does that mean we should ban hikers though? Because like, two hikers were making out and they nearly caused an accident? No. So, but even if you could say, well, it was never documented, but there was a widespread problem, it still wouldn't be a reason to ban mountain biking. It might be a reason to, assess how you enforce the rules against the people in the park, but it's not going to be a reason to ban people from using it. And we've seen that over the intervening 20 years. All around New Jersey, in almost every other county, there's to some degree of mountain biking access is normal. There might not be access in every single park, but there is some degree of mountain biking access incorporated into most park programs. Not only in other counties' parks, but in some state parks as well. So Union County is a minority here. Their policy is an outlier, and I think it's an outlier because people have realized in the last 20 years what the people in Union County who opposed the mountain bike ban realized. And it's worth noting not all of them were bikers. Some of them were just people who were interested in fair government policy. Didn't think that it made sense to exclude, what the government admitted even in 1995 was one of the fastest growing user groups, just because some people allegedly had a bad day 20 years ago. And again, I have to say allegedly because there was no documentation of any of it. Just like there was no documentation of anything in Dan Benier's response to my Open Record Act request, which contradicted many of the things he said in the narrative in the white paper, which itself was provided as a supposed source for the things he said in that request, Open Record response request. Of course, when I was asking for source material, I meant, actual documentation. You can't take an essay that some guy wrote and use it as a source material for what the same guy wrote later. And then the fact that they say by way of clarification, and they say we don't have anything to provide you because on one hand there was no ordinance passed, but on the other hand there was an old ordinance, but we're not going to tell you which one it is. Okay? And then they say, but by way of clarification, Dan Benier, who works for the Parks Department, wrote this paragraph. And that's where he talks about they suspended the ban in 93 and allowed it and then resumed the ban in 95, and then there was a problem with mountain biking, and all these people got hurt, and it was damage, and it was awful, and they were killing the trees. No, that's not what happened. Okay, and how do we know it's not what happened? Because they had no documentation of it. There's no documentation of any of this. And guess what? We also know. I think these guys need like remedial English lessons. I mean, somebody get them hooked on phonics stat. By way of clarification. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say they just didn't realize the significance of the words they were using, rather than that they were trying to deliberately mislead, in this instance anyway. We know there's plenty of deliberate misleading elsewhere. They said, by way of clarification. Now, that would refer to something that actually existed to be clarified. But they just got done saying, we have nothing to provide you, no evidence, no nothing, sorry. Then they say, but by way of clarification, yeah, and what exactly are you clarifying? The fact that you don't have anything? Like, how can you clarify something that doesn't exist? This seems like a turn of phrase that you would use if you were either didn't understand what the words meant or you were trying to make it look like you were being helpful when you're not. Now, there's another thing to consider, which is that if you have to try and walk back a statement or clarify it or go back and tell people, well, that's not what I really meant because they don't like what you said, then usually that statement there was something wrong with it, right? Either it really was bad or it really was offensive or it really was incorrect or whatever. If that many people are complaining and then you have to come back and say, well, that's not what I really mean. Well, then you said it wrong, okay? So for any of these things, if somebody could say, well, you're nitpicking. Now, I've never been sued that I know of. But I mean, I imagine if, for example, somebody required me to fill out a legal document, that I would take that damn serious and I would be sure to try and do everything the right way and above board. Because it's a legal document. I mean, I could get sued or something if I screw it up. Aside from the fact that, our legal system, the only way it works is if everybody participates in it in an above board manner. These guys get a legal document, namely an Open Record Act request, which they're required by law to respond to. And the first thing they say is, we don't have anything. Then they say, well, we have this. Then they say, well, we have this. Then they say, well, we don't have anything. Each time they say they don't have anything, and then they respond with, oh, wait, actually, we do have a little more. They're lying. They're lying on a legal document, okay? Now, the only real penalty for that is to sue them. And that's what I ultimately had to do at the very end. I was trying to post-game this after the thing happened, and I had to sue them to get information. I'll get to that in a second. But just to say that the very fact that nobody can get their story straight in 20 years, the fact that they tried to use an essay a guy wrote with no source material as the actual source material for the other paragraph the guy wrote, when the two things contradicted each other, they say by way of clarification, when there's nothing to fracking clarify, that there's, again, like 4 or 5 different stories about when the band began, all from the same people. And that the only things they do agree on are that it was created in 1995 in a back room by a handful of the unelected, or implemented in 95 by a handful of the unelected in a back room, without any public input, without any documentation existing of a widespread problem at Watchung, or the conditions there one way or the other, or a single instance of mountain biking negatively affecting anybody or anything. There's a lot of questions, aren't there, about this mountain bike ban? Yeah. A lot of questions. And that's why I wasn't really all that surprised from the end. I ultimately had to turn around and sue them. Because it's a history of obfuscation and lying. Oh, one more thing about that very first Open Record Act response, the one that contradicted the white paper that was provided as a source of it. Well, that was the first time that I know of, in 3 years of researching this and having a folder this thick of government documents in the shelf downstairs, that was the first time that, as far as I know, the ordinance from 1983 that they say bans mountain biking, even though it contains no mention of mountain biking or even bikes in the word trail. But they say that's the ordinance that bans mountain biking. The first time that ordinance from 1983 was ever linked in writing to the 1995 mountain bike ban that they say it authorized was in 2014, when I followed up my Open Records Act request by saying, well, you say there was no ordinance passed, but then you say there was an old ordinance. Which one is it? If that old ordinance is indeed the ordinance I was talking about, then there was an ordinance passed, and please provide me the information on it. And then I followed up this by saying, and which ordinance was it? Because you never say. So they explain, and they tell me which ordinance it is, and then they explain that it was passed in 1983. For the first time in 20 years, somebody can look up this ordinance and see if it actually said what they say it said, and was about what they say it was about. And lo and behold, it wasn't, right? Nobody knew that. For 20 years, nobody even knew what ordinance they were talking about. There were contemporaneous statements and memos and things going back to the 90s where they talked about an old ordinance in 1995 when they were talking about banning mountain biking. But they never said which one. And the things they did say about the ordinance, for 20 years they were saying it referred to the trails. It referred to the trails in the park, and you couldn't bike on the trails. And then when I finally found out which ordinance was and I read it, the word trail's not even in there. So you can't even say they were referring to it indirectly by talking about what was in it, because that's not in it. Now you could hem and haw and say, well, maybe when they say sidewalks and paths, they really mean trails. Yes, but then why misquote the ordinance? Why not just say sidewalks and paths? They mean the same thing. And secondly, why, you're then left with the fact that that's still not what's in it. So that's not a link to that ordinance. So all we know is an old ordinance that supposedly contains something about trails. Nobody ever says which one. And then I get this ordinance and I find out, well, it is old. It's from 1983. But it contains nothing about the trails in the park or mountain biking generally. And what it is about are regulating where you ride your bike on things like roads, sidewalks, paths, and don't block motor vehicles. Nothing that sounds like it has a great deal to do with the woods in the park. Unbelievable. But the point is, that's the first time that ordinance was linked in writing by name or number to the ban from mountain biking from 1995. So you have the question of, if this ordinance is from 1983 and it authorized a ban on mountain biking on the trails in the park, one, how come the word trails isn't in there, or anything about mountain biking by name or otherwise? But and how come most of what it is about is very clearly paved infrastructure, things like roads and sidewalks that you wouldn't find in a road in the woods. And then secondly, How come this was never linked in writing to the 1995 mountain bike ban in 1995, right? When they created the ban. Hey, this is what authorizes us to do this. Nope, no mention of this ordinance, according to anybody. Not only through 1995, but through the first meeting we had with the county back in February of 2015, whatever it was, at the Galloping Hills Golf Course. We met with 3 county officials, a representative of the contractor, CME Associates, that they hired to do the trail plan, and there was a handful of us bikers who were supposed to represent every cyclist in the county. And nobody at that meeting said, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. We shouldn't really be talking about bike access because first we got to pass a law or change the law because right now it's illegal. Nobody ever said anything about that. So the first time this was ever linked, this ordinance, to the mountain bike ban from 1995 was in that Open Record Act request follow-up from 2014 when I specifically said, okay, which ordinance, and give me all the stuff about it. And that's when they said which ordinance it was. So if the ordinance is from 1983 and the ban on mountain biking is from 1995, the earliest they overlap is 1995. So if that ordinance really authorized that ban, leaving aside the fact that it was created in the back room by the unelected, how come that was never linked in writing at the time? Why was the first time that the two things appeared linked in writing specifically was in 2014, 20 years later? And only because somebody filed like 2 follow-up Open Records Act requests and specifically asked, right? I mean, like, what are they trying to hide? Well, I told about the lawsuit. The lawsuit illustrated what they were in fact trying to hide. They had flyers printed up around the time they put up the new no bike signs, which caused park closures, not just in Watchung, but at every park in the county, which hadn't been closed before. For 20 years, this was just about Watchung. And then when they put the no bike signs back up at Watchung after they've been down for a while, we thought they were actually keeping their word to open the park. Nope, they had new ones made and put them up. They also had new ones made and put up in other parks in the county. And when they did that, they were effectively creating new trail closures. And I got curious about this, and I asked about these signs and about flyers that were posted after the vote to kill the mountain bike access, because the flyers appeared, I didn't know they'd been there before. It looked like they had appeared a day or two after the meeting, and I thought, could they possibly have gotten these printed up beforehand? Now, what I was thinking is that the fact that the flyers appeared so soon was proof that they didn't wait for the vote to print them up. Actually, it's worse than that. The flyers were printed up in 2016. The vote didn't occur until May 18, 2017. So at the time these flyers were printed up, it was around the same time they posted the new no bike signs everywhere. And around the time these flyers were printed up, as far as everybody was being told publicly, the government intended to allow mountain bike access to move forward. So why would they be printing up new no bike signs, creating trail closures again, not only at Watchung, but at parks that were never closed before, and printing up all these flyers? And why would they specifically put on the flyers, mountain biking is forbidden at all county parks, and then a statement threatening to confiscate your bike if it was ridden in the park? Well, they did. And I was curious, so I filed an Open Public Record Act request, post-gaming this, as it were, trying to figure out what went wrong. And I figured if I could get some kind of clue as to when these flyers were made, you know, like if they didn't wait for the vote to print them up, then obviously that was a sign that they kind of knew how things were going to go, and it wasn't really a fair vote. Surprise, they actually had them printed up before people even knew there was going to be a vote, when as far as everybody knew, the mountain bike access was moving forward. Again, they were printed up in 2016. And there was a series of emails back and forth about what wording should be put on these flyers that was redacted. And they told me it was redacted because they were still deliberating it. Well, the very fact that the flyers exist is proof that they're not, because they were printed. Then you have the fact that if what they were deliberating was the penalty, well, if you believe the government's claims about this ordinance from 1983 authorizing a ban on mountain biking, then nothing about penalties has been deliberative since 1983 when the ordinance was written. Secondly, if you believe it's about the idea of park access now and whether or not to allow that, well, they already had a vote. So whatever it is about mountain biking and not allowing it that you're deliberating, or deliberations are done, there's nothing that's still deliberative at this point in time. Leaving aside the fact, why is somebody from the county police department and somebody from the parks department having a discussion about what the penalty should be if you're caught riding in the park. Shouldn't the penalty be decided by what's written in the ordinance? This ordinance that you supposedly claim now, for the first time in 20 years, is about mountain biking. Yeah. But no, apparently they were just content to make up penalties off the top of their head, or threatened penalties. And what I found out is that that thing that made it into the flyers about confiscating your bike, the reason I had to sue them to get this information, and it was going to court for a while until they before it ultimately went to court, they called up and they settled and they disclosed the information. Now, this cost them potentially thousands of dollars. My lawyer's bill was like $4,000. And then it was the court filing fees they had to pay and all that stuff. And then they gave me the information. Now, why were they willing to pay so much to try and hide this? Until they saw we were serious and they were going to go to court and lose. And the lawyer probably told them, just pay up and fork over the info. Why were they willing to try and pay thousands of dollars of your tax money and my tax money to hide this? For the very good reason that it shows them admitting that what they put on those flyers was wrong. In this discussion, you have the police, somebody from the county police and somebody from other county departments talking about what to put on signs and flyers. And somebody from the county police department states that it would be misleading to threaten to take somebody's bike just because they're operating it in the park. That's misleading and we shouldn't put it on the signs. Oh. Now, it didn't end up on the signs, per se, but it did end up on hundreds, maybe thousands of flyers, for all we know, that were distributed at kiosks throughout this and perhaps other parks as well, where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people could see them. So they were putting this out there to the public, this threat to confiscate your property, that they knew wasn't legally authorized by the ordinance that they said bans mountain biking. There is a penalty in that ordinance. I forget what it is. It's like a $20 or $30 fine. Apparently, the threat to confiscate your bike was something about if they thought it was stolen, which had something to do about some stupid thing about if your bike's not registered with the town where you live, which nobody does anymore. I mean, maybe if you went to your town and said, hey, do you have a 20-year-old, 30-year-old registration sticker? They might sell it to you for like $1.50 or something. But certainly nobody's getting pulled over and asked to see their bicycle registration. It's nothing that's enforced. There were programs like this that were short-lived creatures of the bike boom years, and they faded away because people didn't like being nickeled and dimed to death. They didn't do anything, and there was just no point to it. But regardless, going back even to the 90s, that wasn't a part of being a cyclist in modern America. Certainly nowadays, it's about as out of date as segregated drinking fountains. So, I mean, if you could picture somebody pondering how come minorities don't have to sit, let's say, in the back of the bus, and your first response, if you're like me, would be, well, what's wrong with that guy? Yeah, he's behind the times. Yeah, well, anybody who wonders why you don't register, why you're not required to register your bike with the government, or why you haven't done so, yeah, they're behind the times. They're about as ignorant of cycling as the person who wants you to sit in the back of the bus is of modern bus riding. So I had to sue to get the emails because the emails showed them saying amongst themselves that what they ultimately did decide to publish for public consumption was misleading, wrong, and not legally authorized. Essentially, they confessed among themselves to making an illegal threat to confiscate your property. And then putting it, after they already decided amongst themselves that it was misleading and not legally authorized, deciding to put that on hundreds, maybe thousands of flyers and disseminate them to the general public. So your government is not only is there a fishy history to the mountain bike ban, that fishiness persists to this day. Okay, this lawsuit was from September of this past year, not all that long ago. So on one hand, there's a lot of stuff that they never talked about with the government not getting its story straight and not doing things in an above-board fashion 20 years ago. But they're also not talking about all the crooked things the government's doing right now here in Union County, New Jersey. And that's a problem. That's a problem. Part of me wonders why so much effort has been spent, I should say, to enforce a ban on something as really inoffensive as riding your mountain bike. I mean, we're not talking about somebody blowing up, dynamite or somebody opening a whorehouse. We're talking about riding your bicycle in a public park. I I guess I'm trying to wrap my mind how this became such an important thing for the government that they were willing to go to such trouble, even get sued to cover up what they did and what they are still doing. And the only thing I can think of is because they know it's wrong. And we see that in this lawsuit over the Open Record Act request and then redacting something that's not. I mean, when I asked them to explain how something that was already decided could be deliberative, they came back with, well, deliberative means it's part of the deliberative process. Word for word, that was what they said. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I hope they're not paying a lawyer for this. I mean, who wrote this? A 5-year-old? It doesn't even make sense. But the point is, it certainly wasn't an explanation of any kind. And when I did show it to somebody I know who's a lawyer, they said you should contact, here's this lawyer I know who does Oprah cases. You should sue them. Contact him. And that's ultimately what I did. Now, I'm not the kind of person that goes around suing folk. I never thought I'd do this in my life. Honestly, like Michael J. Fox said when he puts the gun belt down in Back to the Future 3, I thought, can't we settle this like men? Like grown-ups? Nope. Government's got to be like, yeah, you'll never get the truth. And of course, my response to that is, it's not your job to try and regulate my access to the truth. It's not even your job to try and regulate my access to the park in that sense. In terms of there being a basis for this policy, you certainly don't have a right to try and determine my access to the truth about how you're trying to regulate my access to the park and why. And I think one of the reasons they've gone so far to try and keep this under their hats, why nobody's willing to talk about it. I mean, you can figure, well, okay, so somebody made a stupid decision 20 years ago. Surely by now they could just admit